Hey everybody! All right, so we are doing a new media today. I almost said a new material and then I tried to say media at the same time. It didn't work. We are using watercolor. You may or may not have touched watercolor before, and just like any other wet media here, I am going to have all of this written beforehand. Pause if you need to copy down all your boxes. They don't need to be the same size as mine, but you do whatever. All right, so let's talk about watercolor itself. Obviously, it is a paint. Specifically, you will find it in a couple different, brain fart, two different forms. You have the pan form like this, where you have little cakes. These ones in particular are called semi-moist because they never completely dry out. So they always look a little bit shiny and a little bit wet. You also have liquid watercolor. And you can also have tubes of watercolor, but I don't have an example of that right here, that look almost like little tiny jars of paint. So we are going to mostly be using these kinds in our class, but all kinds of watercolor really just act the same way. It's just how you get them and how liquidy they are. So we're going to be using this kind. Be aware that this area up here is basically an area where you can mix colors. So if you put a little red in here and a little bit of yellow over here, you might make an orange in that spot, for example. Something good to know is how to clean all of this. Basically just rinse it off with a little bit of water and a paper towel, and that will do you the most good. This one in particular comes apart also by like that. And these will pop out, and these even come out. Some pan types will pop out like so you can replace empty pans and all of that. A pan is not completely empty until it is bare plastic. Keep that in mind. A lot of kiddos try to say, oh, this is empty, and it's just got bottom showing. That's not empty. This one right here, this orange, is pretty close to empty, but it actually isn't. There's a little bit of orange in there still. It's probably only got one or two more paintings in there, but who uses orange that much anyway? All right, if your colors in here are dirty, say for example, if I have some black and it gets into the yellow, it is fairly easy to fix. All you've got to do is start mixing this with just some water. And what I want to do is get all of the black paint that's in there a little bit liquefied. And I'm going to clean off my brush, do this a little bit more. You can see that some of that black has started to go away. And when I'm nearly done, I can finish it off by taking a paper towel or a sponge or something like that and just kind of dabbing the rest of it out. Now, I do want to be a little bit careful because this was pretty wet, and so my paint's kind of disappearing a little bit, but that's okay. That's basically the method. I do this a few more times, and I will have clean yellow once more. All right, so now that you know a little bit about cleaning the palette and all of that, let's talk about the other things that you're going to need. So for watercolor, obviously, you need watercolor itself. You need water of some kind in a jar or a cup or a thing. Try not to fill that too much or it will spill. You need a paintbrush appropriately sized for whatever you're gonna do. I'm doing some fairly small stuff, so a decently small paintbrush works. Other things that might become useful to you and that we're going to use in this particular demonstration are going to be some salt, some rubbing alcohol. This one's in a spray bottle, but you've got a couple different ways that you can apply it. You might have watercolor pencils, and you might have crayons of some kind. So yeah, that's all the stuff that you're gonna need for us. Anything else that you might need would be things to protect your clothes. I've already spilled some red paint on my white sweatshirt, so I feel it. And anything else that you might need to protect the table, such as paper towels or napkins. All right, so we're going to start by doing a wash. A wash of color is just when you want an area filled with some kind of color. There's two ways to go about it. Both of them work fairly decently. Either you wet this with water first and then you paint color on, or you can just paint color on directly in long, steady strokes. If you are a more beginner, I would suggest wetting it with plain water first. So I'm just gonna come in here, and sometimes you gotta kind of shift or move the paper so you can see what's shiny with wetness and what isn't. So that can help you if you're not quite sure what you've already gotten wet yet. Then just pick up some color by wetting your brush and putting it into your pan, or with your liquid watercolor or with your tube watercolor until you have a decent amount of paint made. The more you mix, the more strong that color will be. The less you mix or the more water you use, the less strong your color will be. So I've mixed fairly well, so I have a fair amount of color on there. And now what I'm going to do on this wash is I'm just going to brush across in long, steady strokes. And what this will do is it will help make a nice even color across a large portion of area. So I don't have a big dark area or anything like that. I am going to do the exact same thing in my layering area, because layering requires one little piece of stuff to be a little bit dry. So because it needs it to be a little more dry, I'm not going to wet it first, so you can kind of see me do a wash that is dry. This one I'm gonna do, yeah, this one works. So I'm gonna leave just a little bit knot with my color here, just so you can kind of see the difference of using the color versus not, and the layering technique, which as you might imagine is just putting one layer of color on top of another. And so you can see what it looks like without versus what it looks like with. I'm gonna let that dry. If you need it to dry faster, a blow dryer or a heat gun is your friend, but if you're using a heat gun, please do be careful. So we're gonna come back to that one in a little bit. All right, next, wet on wet. So there's two main things that you're gonna find with watercolor, wet on wet and wet on dry. Wet on wet is whenever you're using wet paint on a wet piece of paper. It's what we did right here. Wet on dry is the exact opposite, wet paint on dry paper. So wet on wet, I'm gonna take my paper, I'm gonna get it wet. Okay, double check, where's my wetness at? Oh, there, pretty good. All right, now I'm gonna pick up some paint with my paintbrush. And when you're doing wet on wet, all you need to know is brush wherever. And what you're gonna find is that the paint swirls, mixes, blooms out, gets messy, and sometimes even drips a little bit. So it makes very cloudy, floaty, blended situations. Anytime that you need your color to bloom out or go a little out of control, just make sure that the surface that it's on or next to is wet, and it will blend and mix and swirl and do all of those cool things. The other technique that's probably the most used in my little book is wet on dry. Now, I'm gonna keep my paper dry this time, and I'm gonna come in with my color. I'm gonna do the exact same little motion with this one as I did on this one, which is whoosh and a dot. And you'll notice that this one stays exactly where I put it. Watercolor will go where water is. So by pre-wetting an area, my watercolor will invade that entire area. And when I do not have water in an area, my watercolor stays exactly where I put it. Now, if I continue putting down more color here, then it will go where watercolor has previously been. Again, watercolor will go where water is. So I can use that to make very clear lines and very small details. All right, after that, we're gonna come over here to salt. Salt is a technique that's a little bit finicky. You have to have everything kind of at the right density almost. I'm not sure if that's exactly the right word to use, but that's the one I'm gonna use today. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a wash of color. I want this to be a fairly intense color, and I don't want it to be too wet. I don't want it to be too dry either. So if you don't get this right this time, don't worry about it. You either had it too dry or you had it too wet. If it's too wet, then it will dissolve our salt crystals that we're using. And if it's too dry, the salt crystals will not stick. So I'm gonna get in here and I'm just gonna make this fairly wet in here. So everything is liquidy enough to move around, but it's not so liquidy that it's gonna drip real bad. So that's about what I'm looking for. Now I'm gonna take some salt, regular salt crystals. These ones are extra coarse. but that's fine. It should still work. I'm gonna pop them onto my paper, and I'm gonna take some extra fine table salt. I'm gonna splatter that down as well. And you're gonna see that all these little salt crystals absorb the water. Again, watercolor goes where water is. So because the crystals come in and collect that water, what ends up happening is you get this very strange little sprinkle effect going on. And you can already see that it's too dry for most of my big salt crystals to even affect anything. But we're gonna leave those there. These do have to completely dry before I can remove the salt crystals. So we're not gonna be able to see what this looks like until probably at earliest an hour from now, when I can brush the salt crystals off. But I can show you what that looks like in a little while. This next one is my actual favorite. It is alcohol. And when I say alcohol, I mean rubbing alcohol. Don't get no nasty ideas, children. Anyway, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a wash, and just like with salt, I want it to be not too wet and not too dry. So I'm looking for something that is wet enough to be glossy, but not wet enough to drip. So I'm over here, I'm gonna get a little bit more color. This does tend to show up a little bit better with darker colors. Light colors like yellow, it won't show up with as well. I'm gonna spread some of this color out because I think I might have had a little bit much. Here, I'll just extend that a little bit. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, fixed my problem. All right, now what I'm gonna do with this rubbing alcohol, this one comes in a little spray bottle, but since I won't need quite that much space, I think what I'm gonna do instead is grab a little pipette. And the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna dip it in, and then I'm going to flick it down onto my finger. You can also do this with your brush. And then I'm also gonna try with this little pipette to drop more deliberate drops. But you can see these kind of almost single cell organism, microscope looking dots appear. Watercolor, again, goes where water is, and alcohol repels water. So the rubbing alcohol repels the color in a very unique sort of way. So again, you can splatter it with your paintbrush, you can splatter it with a little bit of a finger, but do be careful. Rubbing alcohol burns if it gets in your eyeballs, so you want to be either wearing some kind of glasses on your face or safety glasses, or make sure that you're not flinging upward or too violently before doing this, because it can burn real bad, and then you have to wash out your eyeballs, and it's no fun. So be careful. All right, so second to last little box. I added this one on, and I added on Crayon Resist up here because I forgot about it. Sorry, I'm not perfect, I tried. All right, so watercolor pencils. If you have access to watercolor pencils, these are going to act like regular colored pencils until you activate them with water. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to take this pencil, and I'm just going to color this area down here to start. And I'm gonna leave this top area blank because I'm gonna show you another way that you can use watercolor pencils in just a second. And from here, all I'm gonna do is take a brush that has clean water on it. Well, mostly clean, given that I've been using this water for a little bit. And I'm gonna start where my watercolor pencil is thinnest. And I'm just going to get it wet. And you've probably seen little kids' books that have stuff like this, magic marker and such. Where it will only activate once you do something. And when I was a kid, it was this exact thing. You had to activate it with water. Now you have like crazy special secret inks and stuff. But essentially, I've turned something that was a watercolor drawing, or a colored pencil drawing, and I've turned it into a watercolor painting just by painting over it with water. The other way that you can use a watercolor pencil is if you take the pencil itself before using it, dip it into some water, just a little bit. You don't want it to absorb crazy amounts of water or anything like that. And then you use the lead while it's wet. Sometimes, depending on the brand, you sometimes have to dip it a few times so that it will activate the way it normally would. And you can get very smooth, almost felt tip pen looking marks and lines. Last thing that we're gonna look at is a Crayon Resist. Wax from a crayon does not absorb water. So anywhere that you put crayon will resist being painted over. You can use any color crayon. This particular one that I have here is a white crayon, so it will look almost like invisibility things because white crayon, white paper, and all of that. So I'm going to draw a little shape on here. I need to make sure that I'm pressing fairly hard, otherwise I will end up with little gaps in my wax, and that will want to stick, or that will allow gaps in my lines that I'm drawing. So I'm just gonna draw this little shape on here, and then all I need to do is pick up a little bit of paint and paint over it. And what should happen if my crayon is on thickly enough, which it kind of is and kind of isn't. Come on. I had a little bit too much paint. It will not stick where my wax is, and I will be able to see those lines whenever I'm done. So I'm gonna come over here, use a little bit more water, just like that. Hello from the future of the video. Not really, just future of the filming. Okay, so this is dried, at least dried enough that I can paint on top of it without doing some crazy blending stuff. And what I'm gonna do is I'm going to paint another color on top of my yellow that I already have down. One of the things that is important to note about watercolor is that it is essentially transparent. The colors that you put underneath will always partially blend into the colors that you have on top. And they will never really fully cover each other. So I could even do this in several little goes where I have these stripes and I wait for them to dry before adding more stripes on top and waiting for them to dry, so on and so forth. Let me see if I can get a little bit of this last of this orange. So you can see here, I have a little bit of a thin orange right there, and over here, these colors mix together. It's not just this pale orange anymore, it mixes with the yellow to show up. I'm gonna also get, I think, a little bit of this here. So the colors end up mixing and layering on top of one another. They will not fully cover each other up. So if you mess up in watercolor, your best bet is to try and disguise your mess ups because you will not be able to get rid of your mess ups. Anything you do and try to get rid of a mistake will generally make it more obvious. So it's a better idea to disguise it by making that a little darker or like putting a different shape on top of it than trying to cover it, because it's not gonna happen. All right, so in the interest of being able to show you what this salt looks like, we're gonna blow dry it a little bit. Now, scoot back. So when you're blow drying this, you gotta get kind of far back because you don't wanna blow the salt off. So I'm gonna turn this on pretty far away, and I'm gonna be holding my hand here at first so I can see that it's just heat getting through to here, not actual air, until I feel like it's dry enough that it's not gonna cause a problem, so be aware. Okay. Again, I'm keeping this pretty far away. I don't want this too close. I don't want it blowing my paper all over the place. I don't want to have big puddles dripping everywhere. I mean, that might be what you want. You might want cool drip effects, in which case, you know, go nuts and blow things around wherever you want. But like, for the most part, you want it mostly dried farther away. All right, it feels pretty dry. It might not be perfect, but we're gonna go ahead and stop. And from here, you wanna go over a trash can or a sink and just gently brush the salt away. And there were a couple spots that didn't completely dry, but that's okay. And you can see you have a very gritty texture left behind. Even once you remove the salt crystals and they no longer go crunch, 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 you you can see that this basically has all of the salt crystals removed, and I still have these really cool gritty sort of textures here. You can get a similar texture to this also by drying with some saran wrap on top, and it's pretty similar textures.